Good morning. This morning I'm going to complete the portion of this essay entitled Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky by Dr. C.G. Jung. I'm going to complete the second half of the first part of this essay. It's a very long essay, 120 pages. And so this is the second part of this essay, beginning, which is called UFOs as Rumours. And I'm beginning with paragraph 612. There are even eyewitnesses, like Mr. Adamski, who relates that he has flown in a UFO and made a round trip to the moon in a few hours. He brings us the astonishing news that the side of the moon turned away from us contains atmosphere, water, forests, and settlements, without being in the least perturbed by the moon's skittishness in turning just her unhospitable side toward the earth. This physical monstrosity of a story was actually swallowed by a cultivated and well-meaning person like Edgar Seavers. Considering the notorious camera-mindedness of Americans, it is surprising how few authentic photos of UFOs seem to exist, especially as many of them are said to have been observed for several hours at relatively close quarters. I myself happen to know someone who saw a UFO with hundreds of other people in Guatemala. He had his camera with him, but in the excitement he completely forgot to take a photo, although it was daytime and the UFO remained visible for an hour. I have no reason to doubt the honesty of his report. He has merely strengthened my impression that UFOs are somehow not photogenic. As one can see from all of this, the observation and interpretation of UFOs have already led to the formation of a regular legend. Quite apart from the thousands of newspaper reports and articles, there is now a whole literature on the subject, some of it humbug, some of it serious. The UFOs themselves, however, do not appear to have been impressed. As the latest observations show, they continue their way undeterred. Be that as it may, one thing is certain, they have become a living myth. We have here a golden opportunity of seeing how a legend is formed, and how, in a difficult and dark time for humanity, a miraculous tale grows up of an attempted intervention by extraterrestrial heavenly powers. And this at the very time when human fantasy is seriously considering the possibility of space travel and of visiting or even invading other planets. We, on our side, want to fly to the moon or to Mars, and on their side, the inhabitants of other planets in our system, or even in the fixed stars, want to fly to us. We, at least, are conscious of our space-conquering aspirations, but that a corresponding extraterrestrial tendency exists is a purely mythological conjecture, i.e., a projection. Excuse me. Good morning, Mallory. Hi, Ian. Okay, reading on. This is pretty good. Sensationalism, love of adventure, technological audacity, intellectual curiosity may appear to be sufficient motives for our futuristic fantasies, but the impulse to spin such fantasies, especially when they take such a serious form, witness the Sputniks, springs from an underlying cause, namely a situation of distress and the vital need that goes with it. It could easily be conjectured that the Earth is growing too small for us, that humanity would like to escape from its prison where we are threatened not only by the hydrogen bomb, but at a still deeper level by the prodigious increase in the population figures, which give cause for serious concern. This is a problem which people do not like to talk about, or then only with optimistic references to the incalculable possibilities of intensive food production, as if this were anything more than a postponement of the final solution. As a precautionary measure, the Indian government has granted £500,000 for birth control propaganda, while the Russians exploit the labor camp system as one way of skimming off the dreaded excess of births. Since the highly civilized countries of the West know how to help themselves in other ways, the immediate danger does not come from them, but from the underdeveloped peoples of Asia and Africa. This is not the place to discuss the question of how far the two world wars were an outlet for this pressing problem of keeping down the population at all costs. Nature has many ways of disposing of her surplus. Man's living space is, in fact, continually shrinking, and for many races the optimum has long since been exceeded. The danger of catastrophe grows in proportion as the expanding populations impinge on one another. Congestion creates fear, which looks for help from extraterrestrial sources, since it cannot be found on Earth. Hello, Pipilika. So I'm reading on about our modern myth of UFOs. Hence, there seem to be signs in the heavens, superior beings of the kind of spaceships devised by our technological fantasy. From a fear whose cause is far from being fully understood and is therefore not conscious, there arise explanatory projections which purport to find the cause in all manner of secondary phenomena. However unsuitable, some of these projections are so obvious that it seems almost superfluous to dig any deeper. But if we want to understand a mass rumor which it appears is even accompanied by collective visions, we must not remain satisfied with all too rational and superficially obvious motives. The cause must strike at the roots of our existence if it is to explain such an extraordinary phenomenon as the UFOs. Although they were observed as rare curiosities in earlier centuries, they merely gave rise to the usual local rumors. Paragraph 117. The universal mass rumor was reserved for our enlightened rationalistic age. The widespread fantasy about the destruction of the world at the end of the first millennium was metaphysical in origin and needed no UFOs in order to appear rational. Heaven's intervention was quite consistent with the Weltanschauung of the age. That's the worldview of the age. But nowadays, public opinion would hardly be inclined to resort to the hypothesis of a metaphysical act. Otherwise, innumerable parsons would already have been preaching about the warning signs in heaven. Our Weltanschauung does not expect anything of this sort. We would be much more inclined to think of the possibility of psychic disturbances and interventions, especially as our psychic equilibrium has become something of a problem since the last World War. In this respect, there is increasing uncertainty. Even our historians can no longer make do with the traditional procedures of evaluating and explaining the developments that have overtaken Europe in the last few decades, but must admit that psychological and psychopathological factors are beginning to widen the horizons of historiography in an alarming way. The growing interest which the thinking public consequently evinces in psychology has already aroused the displeasure of the academies and of incompetent specialists. In fact, the palpable resistance to psychology emanating from these circles, psychologists who are conscious of their responsibilities should not be dissuaded from critically examining a mass phenomenon like the UFOs, since the apparent impossibility of the UFO reports suggests to common sense that the most likely explanation lies in a psychic disturbance. We shall therefore turn our attention to the psychic aspects of the phenomenon. For this purpose, we shall briefly review the central statements of the rumor. Certain objects are seen in the Earth's atmosphere, both day and by night, which are unlike any known meteorological phenomenon. They are not meteors, not misidentified fixed stars, not temperature inversions, not cloud formations, not migrating birds, not aerial balloons, not balls of fire, and certainly not the delirious products of intoxication or fever, nor the plain lies of eyewitnesses. What as a rule is seen is a body of round shape, disc-like or spherical, glowing or shining fierily in different colors, or more seldom, a cigar-shaped or cylindrical figure of various sizes. It is reported that occasionally they are invisible to the naked eye, but leave a blip on the radar screen. The round bodies in particular are figures such as the unconscious produces in dreams, visions, etc. In this case, they are to be regarded as symbols representing in visual form some thought that has not thought consciously, some thought that was not thought consciously, but is merely potentially present in the unconscious in invisible form, and attains visibility only through the process of becoming conscious. The visible form, however, expresses the meaning of the unconscious content only approximately. In practice, the meaning has to be completed by amplificatory interpretation. The unavoidable errors that result can be eliminated only through the principle of waiting on events. That is to say, we obtain a consistent and readable text by comparing sequences of dreams dreamt by different individuals. The figures in a rumor can be subjected to the same principles of dream interpretation. If we apply them to the round object, whether it be a disc or a sphere, we are once again getting an analogy with the symbol of totality well known to all students of depth psychology, namely the mandala, Sanskrit for circle. There's a footnote here. More rarely reported cigar form may have the zeppelin for a model. The obvious phallic comparison, i.e., a translation into sexual language, springs naturally to the lips of the people. Berliners, for instance, refer to the cigar-shaped UFOs as a holy ghost, and the Swiss military have an even more outspoken name for observation balloons. Carrying on. Truth Convoy says, ancient threats were muscular giants, but now we fear skinny gray aliens. Yeah. Okay. Carrying on. This is not by any means a new invention, for it can be found in all epochs and in all places, always with the same meaning, and it reappears time and again, independently of tradition, in modern individuals as the protective or apotropaic circle, whether in the form of the prehistoric sunwheel, or the magic circle, or the alchemical microcosm, or a modern symbol of order, which organizes and embraces the psychic totality. As I have shown elsewhere in the course of the centuries, the mandala has developed into a definitely psychological totality symbol, as the history of alchemy proves. I would like to show how the mandala appears in a modern person by citing the dream of a 6-year-old girl. She dreamt she stood at the entrance of a large unknown building. There a fairy was waiting for her, who led her inside into a long colonnade and conducted her to a sort of central chamber with similar colonnades converging from all sides. The fairy stepped into the center and changed herself into a tall flame. 3 snakes crawled round the flame as if circumambulating it. Here we have a classic archetypal childhood dream, such as not only dreamt fairly often, but is sometimes drawn or painted without any suggestion from outside, for the evident purpose of warding off disagreeable or disturbing family influences and preserving the inner balance. Paragraph 621. Insofar as the mandala encompasses, protects, and defends the psychic totality against outside influences and seeks to unite the inner opposites, it is at the same time a distinct individuation symbol, and was known as such even to medieval alchemy. The soul was supposed to have the form of a sphere, on the analogy of Plato's world soul, and we meet the same symbol in modern dreams. This symbol, by reason of its antiquity, leads us to the heavenly spheres, to Plato's supra-celestial place, where the ideas of all things are stored up. Hence, there would be nothing against the naive interpretation of UFOs as souls. Naturally, they do not represent our modern conception of the psyche, but give an involuntary archetypal or mythological picture of an unconscious content, a rotundum, as the alchemists called it, that expresses the totality of the individual. I have defined this spontaneous image as a symbolical representation of the self, by which I mean not the ego, but the totality composed of the conscious and the unconscious. I am not alone in this, as the Hermetic philosophy of the Middle Ages has already arrived at very similar conclusions. The archetypal character of this idea is borne out by its spontaneous recurrence in modern individuals who know nothing of any such tradition any more than those around them. Even people who might know of it never imagined that their children could dream of anything so remote as Hermetic philosophy. In this matter, the deepest and darkest ignorance prevails, which is, of course, the most unsuitable vehicle for a mythological tradition. Paragraph 622. If the round shining objects that appear in the sky be regarded as visions, we can hardly avoid interpreting them as archetypal images. They would then be involuntary automatic projections based on instinct, and as little as any other psychic manifestations or symptoms can they be dismissed as meaningless and merely fortuitous. Anyone with the requisite historical and psychological knowledge knows that circular symbols have played an important role in every age. In our own sphere of culture, for instance, they were not only soul symbols, but God images. There is an old saying that God is a circle whose center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere. God, in his omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, is a totality symbol par excellence, something round, complete, and perfect. Epiphanies of this sort are, in the tradition, often associated with fire and light. On the antique level, therefore, the UFOs could easily be conceived as gods. They are impressive manifestations of totality whose simple, round form portrays the archetype of the self, which, as we know from experience, plays the chief role in uniting apparently irreconcilable opposites, and is therefore best suited to compensate the split-mindedness of our age. It has a particularly important role to play among the other archetypes, in that it is primarily the regulator and orderer of chaotic states, giving the personality the greatest possible unity and wholeness. It creates the image of the divine human personality, primordial man or anthropos, a Chun-Yen, true or whole man, in an Elijah who calls down fire from heaven, rises up to heaven in a fiery chariot, and is a forerunner Messiah, the dogmatized figure of Christ, as well as of Kidder, the verdant one, who is another parallel to Elijah. Like him, he wanders over the earth as a human personification of Allah. And there's a footnote here. Significantly enough, Elijah also appears as an eagle who spies out unrighteousness on earth from above. Paragraph 623. The present world situation is calculated as never before to arouse expectations of a redeeming supernatural event. If these expectations have not dared to show themselves in the open, this is simply because no one is deeply rooted enough in the tradition of earlier centuries to consider an intervention from heaven as a matter of course. We have indeed strayed far from the metaphysical certainties of the Middle Ages, but not so far that our historical and psychological background is empty of all metaphysical hope. Consciously, however, rationalistic enlightenment predominates, and this abhors all leanings toward the occult. Desperate efforts are made for a repristinization of the Christian faith, but we cannot get back to that limited worldview which in former times left room for metaphysical intervention. Nor can we resuscitate a genuine Christian belief in an afterlife or the equally Christian hope for an imminent end of the world that would put a definite stop to the regrettable error of creation. Belief in this world and in the power of man has, despite assurances to the contrary, become a practical and for the time being irrefragable truth. This attitude on the part of the overwhelming majority provides the most favorable basis for a projection, that is, for a manifestation of the unconscious background. Undeterred by rationalistic criticism, it thrusts itself to the forefront in the form of a symbolic rumor, accompanied and reinforced by the appropriate visions, and thus activates an archetype that has always expressed order, deliverance, salvation, and wholeness. It is characteristic of our time that the archetype, in contrast to its previous manifestations, should now take the form of an object, a technological construction, in order to avoid the odiousness of mythological personification. Anything that looks technological goes down without difficulty with the modern man. The possibility of space travel has made the unpopular idea of a metaphysical intervention much more acceptable. The apparent weightlessness of the UFOs is, of course, rather hard to digest, but then our own physicists have discovered so many things that border on the miraculous. Why should not more advanced star dwellers have discovered a way to counteract gravitation and reach the speed of light, if not more? Nuclear physics has begotten in the layman's head an uncertainty of judgment that far exceeds that of the physicists and makes things appear possible which but a short while ago would have been declared nonsensical. Consequently, the UFOs can easily be regarded and believed in a physicist's miracle. I still remember with misgivings the time when I was convinced that something heavier than air could not fly, only to be taught a painful lesson. The apparently physical nature of the UFOs creates such insoluble puzzles for even the best brains, and on the other hand, has built up such an impressive legend that one feels tempted to take them as a 99% certain psychic product and subject them accordingly to the usual psychological interpretation. Should it be that an unknown physical phenomenon is the outward cause of the myth, this would detract nothing from the myth, for many myths have meteorological or other natural phenomena as accompanying causes, which by no means explain them. A myth is essentially a product of the unconscious archetype and is therefore a symbol which requires psychological interpretation. For primitive man, any object, for instance an old tin that has been thrown away, can suddenly assume the importance of a fetish. This effect is obviously not inherent in the tin, but is a psychic product. And then there's a reference in the footnotes to Dr. Jung's essay called Concerning Rebirth in the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, which is volume 9-1 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, paragraphs 240 and following. There's another footnote. It is a common and totally unjustified misunderstanding on the part of scientifically trained people to say that I regard the psychic background as something metaphysical, which, on the other hand, the theologians accuse me of psychologizing metaphysics. Both are wide of the mark. I am an empiricist who keeps within the boundaries set for him by the theory of knowledge. Okay, so that is the second half of that part. In the next part, I will begin reading part 2 of this essay, which is called UFOs and Dreams. That will be fun, but I can't keep reading all the time because this is a 120-page essay, and I find that what happens to me is there's so many complex ideas in Dr. Jung's work which we have not thought about. Okay, they have not been presented to the general public, and therefore, as they're presented to you over some period of time, it's very common. I think many people just go to sleep. I call it hypnotizing, and I find myself that at some point in my reading, I start to become hypnotized, notwithstanding the fact that I have a small problem with cataracts right now. So I do have a trouble reading the words on the page occasionally. But it's but therefore, as I read in this way, I certainly understand why many people just simply bounce off Dr. Jung's work. They just can't read it because it's actually too difficult to read. And anyway, I'll look at your comments now. Miles says there have been a lot of secret military craft tested and crashed. Makes sense that people not with clearance might think aliens. Yes, that's certainly true. And as I said in yesterday's video, my father had an experience in, I'm not sure exactly when it was, but it was in the late 1940s after World War II, or maybe early 1950s, in which he was on the roof of our garage at our family farm in upstate New York, and he saw a UFO in that direction. Well, that direction happened to be the direction of Griffiths Air Force Base, which is about 20 to 25 miles to the northeast of our farm. And so it's very likely that he was seeing some aircraft. This was just when jets were starting to get built and tested. And so it's very likely that the Air Force was using Griffiths as a place for testing these aircraft. And so while my father thought that he saw something that was physically impossible, I suspect that he simply saw something that he had never seen before at that point in time. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And Mallard says Jung takes some digestion. Jung definitely takes some digestion, and I've been trying to digest it for 32 years now, his collected works. So I sympathize with the issue. And anyway, so I am going to try this afternoon to begin this section called UFOs and Dreams, and it's very long, just that section. For example, pages or dreams 1 through 4 go from page 330 to page 368, which is 38 pages, just for 4 dreams. And the whole thing on dreams goes for 52 pages. So it's going to come out in 3 segments, I guess, is the way I divided it up. And Miles says they even have huge lasers on some experimental planes. Yes, absolutely. And Joseph Campbell says, how should a young man properly integrate his anima from his unconscious? Well, I think that the best way to do it, and I'm not a mental health professional, so you might want to read up on anima. I have done some videos about it. But in my experience, once I started to recognize my anima and its control over me, then I was able to control its effects on me. And let me just see if I have this picture. I have a picture of my mother when she was 18. Many of you have probably seen this picture because I do show it from time to time. And, well, let's see, maybe I can just put it back in because I have too many pictures set up on my OBS. So let me just try one other thing here. I'll bring it up so that you can see the picture. Yesterday was the 10th anniversary of my mother's death. And so I was especially sensitive to her yesterday. But in any case, I do have a good picture of her, and it very definitely amounts to what my anima has me look for. Okay, in other words, okay, so here she is. Wait a minute. Okay, now I think I can give this to you. Okay, so this is my anima, and my guess is that most men's anima comes from some sort of image of their mother. Mine certainly does, because whenever I see a woman who has brown hair and long brown hair and framing her face like this, doesn't matter what her appearance is in terms of her features, but that frame of the brown hair around the face, my anima says that's the woman for you, and if you follow that message from your unconscious, from your anima, then you can get yourself in trouble, especially if you have already have a girlfriend or a spouse, and it has gotten me into trouble in the past, and now I know. And so when my anima unconsciously says that's the girl for you, then I say, wait a minute, I have to live in the 21st century, you don't. And so therefore I'm going to control that urge to go make a connection with that girl, that woman. And so in that way, I think I have integrated my anima. I don't say I've integrated entirely, because if you go into Dr. Jung's essays on this topic, you'll see that there are many complicated issues with respect to the syzygy. And if you read Ion, and on the YouTube channel, there is a playlist on Ion, AION, and chapter 8 of Ion does address the syzygy, which is the idea of the anima, among other things. Let's take Mom away here. This picture was taken when she was 18 years old, and as you see, she was quite the dish in those days, and I was born about a year later. So my father saw that, and away he went. He was decapitated, as they say. Let's see. Joshua says, why was Freud so addicted to cigars? I have no idea, but I do know that nicotine is addictive, and cocaine as well, and so no doubt he was addicted. And just keeping in mind that Dr. Freud had cancer of the jaw in his later life, and had to have a very unpleasant surgery in which part of his jaw was removed at a time when there were not there were not very sterile conditions in operating rooms, and no particularly good anesthetics. And so if you read Irving Stone's book about Freud, which is a very interesting book, I recommend that book. I have read it on Audible. I'm just trying to remember what its name is. Anyway, it's Irving Stone as the author. And if you put on Amazon, if you were to put Irving Stone and Sigmund Freud in the search, you'd immediately find this book, and it's a very effective, biographical novel. That it's a novel, but it really covers a lot of Freud's life, and I read that about 30 years ago now, and it was really a stunning experience. But one of the things in that book is the description of the surgery when Freud had part of his jaw removed because he had cancer in the jaw, and that was very likely caused by either his pipe smoking or his cocaine smoking, is what I guess. And Joseph says, thanks and hello to everyone from Los Angeles. Very definitely. My largest following in the world is from California. And that's also because I think it's about a quarter, something like 26% of all internet activity in the world comes from California. I learned that long ago when I was very involved in these things. And Miles is one of the few from Calgary, so I don't know how much of the internet activity of the world comes from Calgary, but nothing like California, that's for sure. So I'm very happy to have Miles here as sort of a canary in the coal mine kind of thing. Anyway, okay. All right, so I'm going to terminate this video now, and hopefully later on I will think my voice is back in fettle again, and I'll be able to read on into the first couple of dreams about UFOs. So thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you again soon.